In this video, I'd like to follow up on one I just did on using FusionReactor's crash protection, which is also referred to as NGuard feature. And I had commented in that previous video, well, I talked about how to set it up, how to set up the mail settings, but I'd commented that I'd like to focus, when I use FusionReactor and these features, I focus on the ability to just send an email notification. You can also have it do things like reject request, queue request, or in the case of runtime protection, abort request. That's what the protection part or the NGuard part of the tool and the feature is. But I'm saying that I make the most use of just the email notification. And I said in the video that I would follow up with a discussion of those emails. So let's do that now. So just as a reminder, I had set up my server to tell me if ever 20 requests were running for 20 seconds, and I talked in the previous video about how I decided that number. And anyway, I said that I would get an email if there was a problem, and that's what I appreciate about this, is that I get sent an email. Well, here's an example of such an email. Okay, so and again, the other video talked about setting things up, but assuming you get the email, comes from whatever address you told it to come from. It says what the name of the server is. My server happens to be hosted on Edge Web Hosting. Thank you to them. And it's telling me that it came from that server. The name of the instance as you create it within FusionReactor, that name is there. And some people often ask, hey, can I change that? To change that, you would have to open up the FRAM instance, the 8087 instance, and you'd have to edit it. And that would require a little restart of either ColdFusion or Rilo or Lucy or whatever you're monitoring with FusionReactor. But anyway, yes, you can change that. And this was configured, remember when we talked about in the FusionReactor settings, the last field here. That gets pre-populated when you set things up. You may never even pay attention to it, but that's the connection between that and that. Okay, so if you want to change that you can just change immediately in the FusionReactor instance that you've set up the email settings for, and it will take effect immediately. Okay, and so then it tells you some very important things that I always want to make sure people pay attention to. When was the alert generated? Now you might look at your email client and see when it was generated, and that may be the same time, but be careful, it may not be. Or you may look at your inbox and see this. Just be careful, it may not be the same time. There may be a delay due to your mail server, due to other issues. So I always tell people pay attention to when it says it was generated. Then you see what kind of alert it was. Now I told you in the previous video that I prefer the running request alert. So I said if there were 20 requests running for more than 20 seconds, I wanted to be notified. And here I'm being told, yep, there were 29. Now, we can talk later or perhaps another time about how it could be that I could have 29 when the CF limit in my CF administrator was 25. But in the interest of time, let's leave that for now and talk about the rest of this email. So the next line tells you things like how many requests were running. Now you might again say, well, how can this be 27 when that said 29? Well, these are all being calculated on the fly as the lines are being generated. And so there was a moment where there were 29 and perhaps milliseconds later there were only 27. Okay, so just let that go. Then it shows you the min, max, and average. So yeah, I happen to have a pretty bad situation here. This is in milliseconds, so my average response time of request was 187 seconds, and the worst was 331 seconds, and the best was 21 seconds. Pretty bad. You don't want that. And as I said in the previous video, that's why I like this alert more than any, because if I've got a situation where many requests are taking a long time, I want to understand that and get into it. So anyway, let's look into what the alert can do. Now, the next thing that the alert shows you is what's called the current triggering request. And depending on the kind of alert, there may or may not be one, and it may or may not be important. So in fact, in this one, remember this was 20 requests more than 20 seconds, running over a period of more than 20 seconds. Well, this had only been running for 470 seconds. It's the straw that broke the camel's back, as it were, the one that pushed it over the 20 limit. But it's not that important. It's only 400 milliseconds old at this point. So I don't recommend, when you're looking at this kind of running request quantity alert, don't pay attention to the first one. Ignore that. We'll come back to what those details are in a moment. But just as you go down the email, the most important stuff follows that. What requests are running? And all three alerts would give you this if any requests were running. And with the running request alert, there's usually going to be many. With a memory alert or a long request alert with one, there may only be one long running request, so you may not have many. But remember, there were more than 20 running over 20-second period. And as you look at this alert, you see lots of great information. You see the URL that was requested. You see the IP address from which it was requested. You see how long the request was running at the moment the alert was fired. Now, these are not in order. They look like they are here, but that's just coincidental because there's a couple that are not in order and there's ones that are not. So there's no order, unfortunately. But you can usually just kind of visually, because this set of columns always starts at this point, you can kind of look at this and see how many characters there are before you see the milliseconds, and then I can quickly see, okay, that's 331 milliseconds. Whoa, that's 223 milliseconds, 299. So you can pretty much quickly spot the really long running ones. But let's focus on the URL. That's the URL that the user was requesting. If there was a query string, that'll be there. Yep, so you get all that. If there's path info, if you know what that is, that'll be there. And then check this out. If the request was running a query, then you'll see what the query was. At that moment, this was the query that was running. And that can be very helpful. And there's nothing here that I'm worried about you all seeing, so it's okay. Anyway, so we focus on the URL. There might be some significance there. Are they all from the same site? You know, some of you have multiple applications with different domains. Maybe you'll see they're all from the same site or not. Maybe they're all the same page or not. Maybe they all have the same query string or not. Maybe they're all running a query or not. Okay, so these are all things that you want to pay attention to before you go any further, because you might get a big picture idea of what was going on just from those clues. And are they all from the same IP address? Now, I do happen to have several from the same IP address. Look at the ending in .246, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So 9. And then if I look at the time at which they were started, that's what this column is. Well, these all started at 12:53, 12:54, 12:55, 12:56. So they're not necessarily all starting in the same moment, but sometimes you'll find that. Now, before I go any further, I want to show one other thing. If you get such an alert, do look at this last column here, or first column. This first column is a request ID. FusionReactor gives every request a request ID. That's a very nice feature, and we'll use it in a moment. But what I want you to notice is if you get this alert and all the request IDs are in the single digits or low double digits, well, that probably means that CF or Rilo or Lucy or whatever you're monitoring has just restarted. In which case you might want to ignore the alert if you only get one. Remember, in the previous video I said you'll get one every minute that the condition exists. So if we get one alert and all the numbers are low and we don't get another alert a minute later, I'd be inclined to think, okay, that was just CF, in my case, was slow getting started. That happens. Loading up various things takes up a little bit of time initially. If I never got another one in the next minute or subsequent minutes, I'd let it go and just ignore it. So sometimes you will want to just look at this, quickly eyeball this, eyeball this, eyeball this, and then maybe eyeball this and go, oh, okay, I'll ignore this one. But let's say this was a bigger one. And in fact, I've got an example of one with a larger number. So if I page down here, these were, in the thousands, and I've got some that are in the hundreds of thousands. Just depends on when the problem happens, how long CF's been up. So anyway, you want to pay attention to that and see if there's queries running and look into that. Now, sometimes you will see queries running, sometimes you won't. That might be significant. But here's where the value really is. I mean, if this is all that it gave you, it might be really valuable. But I'm telling you, the most valuable part is actually later in the email. So let's go back to this first one. So there were these requests running for this long time. I'd like to know what they were doing. And this is so valuable. I can know exactly what they were doing, down to the line of code. In the case of CFML, down to the line of code. If it was Java, it would be down to the line of Java code. I can see it right down to the line of code. Now here's the way it works. Remember, if I page up, there were these details about the particular current triggering request. Well, if you look at the size of this scroll bar, I happen to be looking at this in Outlook. You could be looking at something else. And by the way, if you look at this in Gmail, be very careful, because when you're looking in Gmail, it might present to you in one browser tab multiple emails. So you'd want to use the feature in Gmail to say, show me the original email. Click the little button to the top right corner of the email and say, show original email. And it'll open up a new window, and the entire window will just be that email and not some other email. I don't happen to have Gmail open, so I can't show you, but just take my word for it. Look for show original email and you'll appreciate what I'm talking about. Anyway, so I want you to notice this is a big email, and yet we've only looked at just the very top of it. There, the first screen down was that, and then begins on the third screen down what's listed here as the stack trace, or it's really a thread dump. A thread dump is a list of stack traces, and I mentioned in the previous video that a previous video I'd done was just about reviewing stack traces within the FusionReactor interface. Well, now we have stack traces within this alert. And that's the golden thing about this, is that we can know for each one of these requests what they were doing down to the line of code by looking for their stack trace. For every request here, there is a stack trace down here. Now, there's also lots of other stack traces, and I talked about this a bit in the previous video, I think. But anyway, let me just clarify it now. There's a reference handler, there's a finalizer, and if I page down, there's GC daemons, there's Jetty HTTP services, there's things saying QTP I've never paid attention to, there's cache managers, timers, there's all kinds of stuff. And I'm only a quarter of the way, or even a tenth of the way down this email. So listen, you can't just page down and try to look for stuff. Don't do it. You're going to waste your time. Don't do it. Instead, go back up to the top, find a request that you're interested in. Let's say I'm interested in this one that's taking 266 seconds. 266 seconds. I want to know what that one's doing. I get the request ID. It's 29. I copy that to the clipboard. You can right click and copy it, or Control C. And then in whatever program you're using, do a find. Now in Outlook, you can click this button that says find. You can also do F4. That's it. Don't do Control F. That's a forward. But I can do that, and I happen to have multiple monitors. Let me get that find dialog box. There you go. And I'm going to paste in, that value that I copied. Oh, somehow it didn't happen. Let me get it again. It was, oh, just this one, 13. I'm going to copy that to the clipboard, and you might find it's already pasted in. Now be careful if you paste it in and there's a space. You don't want that space in there, so make sure there's just that number and a space. And watch, when I do this find, now, actually, now that I think about it, 13 is a pretty random number. I'm going to show you. We'll come back to you doing the search in a moment. If you just go to the bottom of the email, to the very bottom of the email, you can drag your mouse. In most Windows clients, you can right click and choose bottom. The point is, down here at the bottom, hey look, there's the details for each request that was running. So I'm going to page up, and you'll see there's a chunk of those 10 or 20 lines for every request that was running. And then eventually, as I page up, I get past those. It was 29, 27 running. And then look, then I went into a stack trace. So most of the email is a thread dump with those stack traces. And then the bottom of the email has the details about the running requests. Okay, so the request ID is at the top. And if you're looking at, let me go to an example that has a larger number. Like I said, if it's only 1 or 2 digits, it's probably not going to be useful anyway. But here's one, there's 219 seconds. I would copy that to the clipboard. Notice if you double click on it, there's a space there. So when I copy it, it's going to be in there. So be very careful to remove that space. But watch, when I do a find next, I'm going to jump to the bottom of the email. Look, it found at the bottom of the email the one request ID. Now you might get another random reference to that value, but you're looking for the request ID equal that. You could add that string if you want to, but I'm telling you 99% of the time when I look for the ID number, it goes right to the bottom. There's nothing else in the middle. And the point is, here's the details about that request. Here's what the URL was. Here's all kinds of good information about it. You can look into this later yourself. I mentioned in the previous video how I do have it tracking the user agent, and you'll find often that a lot of requests you get are from spiders like Bing, Yahoo, Google, even Yandex from Russia, and Baidu from China, and other kinds of knuckleheads you never even heard of. But anyway, the point is, so this is the request that was running, and here's the what. In this case, this one is back from when I was running CF9. This is the thread ID of that particular request. In ColdFusion 9 and earlier, it was JRPP-some number. This other one is from CF11, and it'll be AJP exec, AJP bio, then a port, and then exec. Again, doesn't matter. Just take my word for it. You want to get whatever the thread ID is. You want to get it, and if you've just done the search, you were looking at one that was taking a certain amount of time. Or if you just come to the bottom, here I'm looking at this request 41. He was running for 207 seconds. I'm curious to know what was he taking so long to do. So I'm going to take that thread ID, copy it to the clipboard, and I'm telling you that there should only be one stack trace reference in this email to that thread ID. This request was running on that thread, and this thread dump in this email should have only one stack trace for that thread. So if I do my, in case of Outlook, F4, and paste that in, watch this over on the right. I'm taken, depending on how your client wraps around, I'm taken up into the middle of the email, and I'm taken to the thread dump, sorry, the stack trace for that particular request. I'm going to repeat the find and watch. It's going to say, oh, that's it. That's the only one. And if I do it again, it'll go to the bottom. And there's what we were looking at. I'm going to do it again, and I'm taken up to the middle. So again, there's only, in this email, there's only one reference in the thread dump to that thread ID. Now I'm just telling you all that because you might find others. Sometimes you find threads referred to as waiting on or locked by or owned by some other. So you might see a reference to a thread you looked for over here, but you're really looking for the thread ID on the left. This is the stack trace for that request. Now this isn't a presentation to get into how to interpret the stack trace. That's what the previous video was about, and we'll provide a link to that to help you find it. But we can see from this particular stack trace that this request was running, in my case, line 1539 of blog.cfc. And I talked in the previous video, the one on stack tracing some weeks ago, how you just look for that line of CFML, the first reference to CFML, or in the case of Cold Fusion, CFML, CFC, CFM. And that, looking from the top down, this was the line of code that was running. And once you find it, looking up, this is the tag it was executing. It won't always show a tag either on the previous line or even a couple lines up. You may or may not see this, but often you'll see it says some tag dot do end tag or do start tag, and this is telling me that this was running a query. Line 1539 was a CF query, it was a closing CF query, and it was proceeding to execute that query. And in this case, it was trying to do caching, and it was blocked by this other one. Again, this isn't the thread to get into, or this video isn't the one to get into to discuss that. I talked about things related to how to interpret stack traces, look for other things. But let me just tell you, if you wanted to, you could highlight this and go find out, well, what's he doing? So I'm going to copy that, paste it. Now, oh, that's interesting. In this case, there isn't another one. Now, that's very interesting. How could that be? Well, I can only imagine at the very moment that this stack trace was taken, that particular request thread had finished. And so when it was doing the stack trace, the thread dump, it was already finished. It's possible. In fact, let me go back to the top. Yeah, remember, this is the one where we were just looking at the very beginning of Cold Fusion's life, in my case. And so, yeah, it's possible that one query was setting up a cache query and another one was blocked by it. I won't say momentarily, but at the moment this happened, it was blocked by it. And by the time this was generated, it was no longer listed. That's a pretty unusual situation, but I suppose it's possible. But anyway, the point is, usually you're not going to find a reference to another thread. That's a relatively unusual thing. You're instead just going to find the thread you were interested in, and what it was doing, and you'll resolve whatever the problem is as identified by that. In this case, I know it was doing a query. I can go further and say, oh, it was a query setting up a cache, and the cache was blocked momentarily by a thread, but it isn't anymore. This is another one of those instances where perhaps in the next minute I wouldn't get another email and I wouldn't have bothered looking at it anyway. But you will take this information and again look at the presentation on stack tracing to understand how to interpret the stack trace. And at this point, I'll say one more thing that I often will do. I might be curious, well, how many other requests in this email are also hung up on that same line of code? It's possible there would be. So I'll highlight that, copy it to the clipboard, do my find. Sorry. I'm trying to do it with keyboard shortcuts, and looking at two monitors at the same time is a little challenging. And I'll paste that in, and I'll see, do I have any other references to that line of code? And I'll repeat the find over and over. And I'm finding, if you look over here on the right, you can see that it is finding another and another and another and another. So many of the requests that I had hung up did coincidentally happen to be hung up waiting for that same line of code, and it's just wrapped around and eventually it'll reach the end. And again, you can't see that because I have two monitors, but this is displaying on another monitor that it reached the end of the request. So yeah, in this case, almost all the requests were hung up doing that same thing, and that might be significant. So I just want you to appreciate that there's so much value in these alerts. First, in interpreting them in the big picture, what requests were running, what IP address, when did they run, how long were they taking, what was the URL, what was the query string, what was any query that was running. That alone may be helpful to you. And then noticing, by the ID, is this just within moments of CF coming up, or Rilo or Lucy or Tomcat or JBoss, whatever you're looking at? It might be. That might lead you to say, okay, I need to look at this. But you might want to dig into it further, and that's where you can get the request ID and go down to the bottom and find from that request what's its thread ID. So this one was running for 33 seconds. Let's just see what he was doing. And you can't see it, but I did the find on another window. And it's going to wrap around. And he too was in the same state. So that, in that case, I could say, okay, I think the majority of them are stuck in that state. I might choose to let it go at that point. But you might find different things happening. There may be different lines of code. Maybe you'll find they're all doing queries. You could say that, okay, let me see if there's other requests that are in this same kind of state. And again, if I do this, you'll see that yes, in my case, most of them are. Now, I just saw references to different lines of code, so they're not all doing that particular line of code. In a moment, you'll see there were a couple of requests that were there. That's on line 864, and then this was on line 1159, and that's on 478, and this was on an RSS page. But they were all doing a CF query, and this one looks a little more typical. It just happened to catch it running that query. And I don't know how long this was running. I'd have to go back to the bottom and find out how long. But the point is, you can use this information to understand what's going on in the environment at the moment that you got the alert. That's the value of this. Now, I know this presentation went on quite a bit longer than the other ones had. Maybe we'll break it into multiple parts. But I hope that you can take that information and know how to interpret your emails when they come to you and be able to solve problems as they arise. That's the beauty of this. And if you have any questions or comments, share them in the comments area, and look forward to helping you use FusionReactor to help solve your problems.